Here at the Center for Metropolitan Studies, and I am professor at the University of São Paulo. We are really glad today in receiving Côme Salvaire from the SciencePo. He's a postdoc at the Center for African Studies at SciencePo Bordeaux, and he holds a PhD in political sociology, also from SciencePo. He was supervised by Patrick Legalet, and he's part of a really interesting research project organized by Professor Patrick Legalet and Professor Eduardo Marques, who is also the director of Center for Metropolitan Studies. So we are here at Ciências, Sociais USP and also in the YouTube. Thank you for watching us. And Côme is going to talk about part of his PhD research, and we have this discussion today called From Union to Guild, the transformation of Mexico City's union of sanitation workers across urban autonomization. This is a very interesting topic, as you are going to see now. Thank you, Côme.
Thank you so much, Renata, for the introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. As some of you know, I've been trying to get here for a long time and hoping to get here for a long time, so I'm very, very happy. And again, I'm very grateful for you taking the time to listen to this. I'm going to present a case from my PhD dissertation, from my PhD dissertation, which was a comparative dissertation on Lagos, Nigeria, and Mexico City, on waste politics and popular politics in both cities. So I'm going to present some part of the Mexico City study, specifically on having to do with the Union of Sanitation Workers of Mexico City. I've worked on this, so I finished my PhD dissertation a couple years ago, but you know, it's as a result of postdoc life now, I'm in an African Studies Research Center, so I've been geared toward working more in Nigeria, so I haven't had yet the opportunity to present this part of my work, so I'm very happy to do it today. And it's the first time I will present it publicly, so I'm also really looking forward to your feedback. And but before I get in the case study itself, I want to, as an introduction, I want to embed this case study in sort of a more general proposal that I'm pursuing now as a research, a more general research proposal on how to study labor regulation in urban studies, basically, from a political science standpoint. So I'm going to start with this general proposal, and then I'll go into the case study itself to speak about waste pickers and the union politics in Mexico City. All right, so talking about labor, the labor question and how we can study labor regulation workers has a paradoxical position in urban studies, right? Because on the one hand, my understanding is that the growth of urban studies was a push away for analysis that were very much focused on the workplace, on workers, and you know, some of the, if you take the case of some of the founders of RC21, right, the research group that gathers urban sociologists within the International Sociological Association, some of the founders were Marxists, you know, Marxist urban sociologists, and precisely their effort was to push away from a more orthodox Marxism that was very much focused on the workplace, on workers, and to bring in other issues within then Marxism, obviously with David Harvey, with Enzo Mingione, we started bringing in some more Polanyian questions into the picture, with Edmond Pretzey, and of course with Manuel Castells, who theorized in the 70s this shift that was to come, that was already there a bit in Mexico City, where he was working also of political conflictuality from the workplace, from work to collective consumption. That was Manuel Castells' big theory. So this idea that it's so much to the workplace that we should pay attention now, we should also pay attention to other problems, to questions what he called collective consumption, having to do with urban services, housing, etc. So Castells' analysis at the time found particular resonance in Mexico City, right? Because it was then the urban popular movement that was growing and that was outside of Mexican unionism, although many militants came from independent unions, that was bringing forth different issues related to housing, to access to land tenure, to public services, etc. So urban studies grew as a push away from these questions related to labor, the production processes, labor processes. But at the same time, urban studies has been very close, has remained very closely connected to the realities of labor in cities, of labor processes, and of the transformation of labor when looking at questions of informality, at questions of informality in public space, at urban popular movements, at patronage, at urban services, because every time we see a lot of cases when colleagues, including myself, work, for example, on urban popular, on urban services that tend to always fall back onto questions of labor, right? When you're looking at the transportation infrastructure of Lagos, Nigeria, like my other supervisor, Laurent Fourchard did, you tend to fall back on questions of how do you control labor, how do you regulate the work of those who operate that informal transport infrastructure. So there's this constant, even though urban studies was a push away from these production processes, labor, etc., there's a constant fallback. It's a question that keeps coming back, this labor question, into urban studies. Many colleagues also have looked extensively at movements of informal workers within urban studies, relations to public space, mostly geographers. So it's a question that keeps coming back without necessarily, I think it's a bit, so there's this ambiguity in urban studies in that we're very close to it, but we're not necessarily paying attention to this labor question in a very systematic manner, with systematic attention to the issue, as considering labor issue and labor regulation as a we could say as a part in and of itself of urban studies. And my impression is that we're not looking at it necessarily systematically, especially from the standpoint of political science, right? There's a lot of studies on, for example, again, popular movements emerging from informal economies, but we don't have that much. There are things, of course, but we haven't focused that much, I think, on how these questions of labor shape also urban institutions, bureaucracies, public policies. That is, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit, how increasingly municipal governments might be developing increasingly de facto means of trying to regulate labor in cities, to control the way workers organize, and how that might shape political institutions. I'm going to try to clarify this. But for now, just what I want to say here is that what I'm going to present now is the product of this. That is, I was working on questions of waste management, and I fell back onto the labor question. And now I'm trying to systematize, trying to think more systematically about this issue and how it matters in urban studies and how it matters in how political urban institutions transform, develop public policies to tackle issues related to labor. Is that more or less clear? So I think that within this picture of looking at labor in cities, urban political scientists have a particular interesting perspective because we're used to seeing actors and objects that play a role in labor processes and labor regulation. It can be municipal governments, it can be cooperatives, it can be patronage networks, it can be gangs, brotherhoods, guild-like organizations such as the one I'm going to talk about, that the more traditional sociology of industrial relations has sometimes been more reluctant to bring in, as it's remained quite focused on central state regulation, unions, and we see a lot more actors, and that's, I think, is interesting to bring in. So I think urban studies have a lot to say, and particularly urban political science has a lot to say about how labor regulation operates today and how it shapes political institutions in contemporary cities. So here with the case of Mexico City's Union of Sanitation Workers, I want to suggest that municipal governments might be playing a growing role de facto in regulating labor, even though that falls out of their constitutional prerogatives, and particularly so when central states have fallen out of the picture of the regulation of some parts of urban economies as a result of informalization and decentralization. So even when labor regulation falls completely out of the scope of the constitutional scope of municipal governments, we might see there might be still push to regulate labor, attempt to shape workers' organization for two main reasons. The first one is that in the case of left governments, it can be part of efforts to reduce inequalities, to intervene on labor processes, to limit extreme exploitation, to protect the health of workers, etc. But also as, and probably most importantly, as intermediary goals, that in many cases to implement public policies, to reshape urban services. You sometimes need to intervene to implement forms of labor regulation in order to implement environmental protection measures, to reform public transportation, to regulate the construction industry, security, or here in the case of waste management. We'll see that in order to reshape and to transform this waste management system, I really have to be close, okay. Mexico City's government has been pushed to develop various efforts to attempt to regain control over the regulation and the collective organizing of waste workers. So, but in so doing, these urban governments, such as the Mexico City governments, in the case I will develop, they don't operate in a vacuum. They do not only confront free markets either, but rather they confront very established actors that have developed a strong capacity often to regulate labor in the cities. For example, in Lagos, I looked at the role that some street lords were playing in controlling an underemployed male labor force in the streets of Lagos. If you want to implement any, if you want to collect any tax to start with for the Lagos government, you have to be able to work with those people that control the labor that's actually going to facilitate the tax collection and a number of different things in, for example, in transportation. But the same applies here, for example, in Mexico City, where what I will describe now is one organization that used to be a union, that used to be very integrated in Mexican state corporatism, that evolved into a guild-like organization, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that, but that it's an organization that the Mexico City government will confront with, will have to struggle with, to regain, to try to implement some forms of labor regulation, to regain control over collective organizing. So I'll speak of this guild-like organization, and I'll try to show by the end of the presentation how it is at the intersection in the struggles between the city government and this guild-like organization that the labor conditions and practices of these workers have been shaped over the past couple of decades. Is it more or less clear so far? The intention, that's the general intention. Now the reality. All right, so the general argument, first I'm going to try to trace how, well, the core of the presentation is going to be about trying to trace how these guild-like organizations emerged in Mexico City and how it came to control waste workers across Mexico City and waste collectors, including public waste collectors. So I'm going to try to describe a shift from, I'm going to look at the Union of Sanitation Workers of Mexico City, and I'm going to show how it evolved over a period of 30 years or so from a union corporation that was very well, whose main objective was very well integrated in the state corporatism of the Mexican party state at the time, whose main objective was first the defense of the labor rights of workers, but second was the support of the political regime. I'll speak to this in more detail. Who's had little capacity, well, who had a lot of autonomy, but whose autonomy was negotiated with the party state, with the PRI. So the union basically was handed the management of waste collection for about a century, throughout the 20th century. But it depended on patronage resources coming from the party state, so upstream, contracts, etc. I'll detail in a minute. And so it negotiated its autonomy with the state. And it was composed of employees only, so employees, public employees, with still some strong hierarchies within the union, as in all Mexican corporatist unions at the time, is hierarchies to access some resources, to get permanent contracts, etc., etc. And I'm going to describe how it shifted to what I call a guild-like organization, whose main focus and main objective is no longer the defense of labor rights, it's no longer the defense of the current regime either, but rather its objective is to defend its monopoly over a craft or trade, so in this case over waste collection. So the main objective of this organization now is to defend a monopoly, much like a traditional guild, of the kinds that were, for example, imported to Mexico under colonial Spain. And the difference with the union corporation, another difference with the union corporation, is that it grew very strong capacity at regulating itself, basically at self-regulating itself, at defining its own norms, that is, or even imposing them at the city level, at having its own means of taxation, of coercion, and mostly at anchoring its autonomy, not in a negotiation with the state, but in its control of the waste economy and the informal economy. Unlike the union corporation, it's composed of workers of very different statuses, ranging from informal workers, helpers, so we call chalanes, to trabajadores de base, so titular workers, permanent workers, and in the middle, volunteers work also. So different, very strong and established hierarchies that are the core of the functioning of this guild-like organization, whose main interlocutor is no longer the central state, but the municipal government. So I'll explain all of this in more detail. Have I spoken a lot of time already? 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. 15. All right. So, okay. There are two processes that explain why this union of sanitation worker moved from being a union corporation to being a guild-like organization. The first one has to do with the informalization and growth of waste economy that occurred in Mexico City from the 1980s, and mostly from the crisis of 1982, the fiscal crisis of 1982, which was followed by a massive economic crisis in Mexico. The second reason is urban autonomization, and this guild-like organization developed, of course, as a result of a very important political transformation, which has been a process of autonomization of Mexico City, which moved from being administered by the federal state to being an autonomous government administered by a left government. So I'll go in detail on that. So first, before I go in, to situate the case, it's I think an outlying case. It's not a common case. First, because it's a bit, if you're looking at how cities regulate labor regulation, this is a bit extreme in the sense that not only is it about an urban government trying to get a grip over workers and how they work in the city, but it's also workers that maintain a public service, right? Even though I'll come to it, they're mostly informal workers. They're part of the delivery of a basic service. So a lot of it is at stake, and that's, from a methodological standpoint, it makes it easier because there's a lot of conflict, there's high stakes, and so it's easier to document. From a comparative perspective, it's also an extraordinary case. In a lot of cities, we've seen unions of waste workers, whether it's in Dakar, for example, in Buenos Aires, unions of waste workers that have collapsed in the 80s and 90s out of cuts in public spending, attempts to dismantle unions, and mostly informalization of waste economies. So in many cities, we've seen in the 80s and 90s the very fast growth of informal waste economies. But in most cases, they've become organized by other types of organizations. So the unions have collapsed, and a bit later, other organizations have come up, whether they were, street lords maintaining, criminal networks, or popular movements, popular associations of workers, such as in Buenos Aires. So in most other cases, there was a rupture between unionized waste workers and the informal organized waste workers of the 2000s. But what's striking about Mexico City is that the same organization stayed in control, the same union. It changed completely, although I'll also show that there were many continuities, but it completely changed its logic of operation. and transform itself through a period of 40 years. And it makes it very interesting because if you're trying to trace the process, then it becomes much easier. So how did I carry this out? Through a participant observation with a group of sanitation workers, these guys here. Was the core of the group from in 2017, 2019. It's over 6 months. You know, a few mornings per week. I would go with them, collect garbage, etc. Also participate in social activities related to the trade, social events for religious festivals or just drinks after work, etc. I also conducted interviews with neighborhood brokers. I was working in a specific neighborhood because I was conducting a neighborhood study at the same time. Neighborhood brokers that interacted with waste workers in one way or another. And then I conducted also an unexpected participant observation at the Mexico City Ministry of Environment. Unexpected because originally I went there to conduct an interview. And for reason I will explain later, they became interested in what I knew about the union of sanitation workers because there was a new administration that has very little knowledge about it, and so they actually brought me in, which enabled me to do a very interesting participant observation. Press archives, particularly to trace the political conflicts between the city and the unions during the 2000s, and also secondary literature because there have been important works on the union. In the 70s, there was an extensive ethnographic study conducted by Héctor Castillo-Bertier, and Vicente Ugalde has also been documented for a long time the policy dimension of waste management in Mexico City. Is it 20 minutes? All right, so I'll try to speed up a bit. So, foundation. Historically, the Union of Sanitation Workers goes back to more than a century ago because it was established shortly after the Mexican Revolution. After the Mexican Revolution, the relationship between the party state that was not yet the party state, but what would become the PRI and the union was established in that the government at the time, the Carranza government, needed workers to reinstall public services in the city, to rebuild the city, and so there was this agreement between the party state and the union that was established, whereby the union was, as early as 1918, granted a lot of autonomy in operating waste management in the city in exchange for popular support, and at the time, for example, in exchange for protecting the city against the raids of Zapatista forces that were still attacking Mexico City. And then later on, under Cárdenas in the late 30s, it became part of, within the larger movement of nationalization of Mexican politics, of integration of peasants within the national corporate system, the union became part of, first, the Sindicato Único de Trabajadores del Gobierno del Distrito Federal, so of the union that gathers all the public workers of the Mexico City government, and it became integrated in the whole national architecture of Mexican state corporatism. So the state corporatist or corporate clientelist configuration was as follows. Basically, the union depended on resources coming from the Regente del Distrito Federal, who was the administrator of Mexico City. So work contracts that were distributed to workers, not only to workers but also to family members, to party members, etc. Public facilities, because the union had all of the management oversight over the waste management infrastructure in the city. They were granted extensive autonomy in managing all of that. That is, the waste management infrastructure, but also individual trucks. Basically, the way it works is, it worked and still works, is that you get a truck. At some point in your career, you manage to get your hand on a waste truck, on a waste collection truck, and then you will start operating it basically as a private enterprise, right? You'll bring family members on it, and you try to extract as much profit as you can from this truck that was provided to you by the state. So there was extensive autonomy in operating the whole sector. The ability also to embezzle public funds, that is to use to use public funds for for either private accumulation or to return them to fund campaigns. So there was many possibilities. The most classic one was uniforms. So very classically, the state granted money to the union leaders to buy uniforms for workers. So part of those resources were used by union leaders for personal wealth, but another part was looped into political campaigns of pre-candidate. So there was a whole lot of schemes like that that made up that relationship between the pre-leadership and the union leadership. And in exchange, so workers were expected to provide political support through voting, campaign labor, political violence. For example, during the 68 movements, waste workers were used as grupos de choque to beat up students on the street. It still is the case. When I was there in 2017, for example, it doesn't operate the same way. It's not as centralized today, but waste workers were also sent to attack a Shane Baum meeting that she was conducting as part of her campaign for the Mexico City mayorship. And I was saying campaign financing also flows back to the PRI through the union. So that was the classic state corporatist configuration. So the processes that jolted it. First, the growth of informal waste economies. So this guy, El Gallo, is, his life typically illustrates this process and how it impacted the union. At some point, so in the 80s, the economic crisis that hit Mexico and Mexico City in particular meant that was followed by a devaluation of the peso and a free fall of real wages, right? So the money you could make at a factory became largely vastly insufficient to maintain a living, right? But, and so there was a growth of unemployment, but also many workers working in the industry that shifted to the informal sector where you could hope to make a living, or you had more chances to make a living than in the formal economy. So, for example, El Gallo, he speaks as, it was much more money any factory gave you to enter this sector at the time that any factory or whatever work that was paid at the minimum wage. So what happened in the 80s is that many workers became willing to enter waste management as informal workers. That is, to enter waste management without being paid by the public. And that was the case of El Gallo, so he had a very difficult life. He grew up in a self-built popular neighborhood at the time where it was built. He wanted to become a professional dancer. He was a gifted dancer, but had to abandon that and ended up on the street. And eventually, he started working as an informal worker, first on trucks and then as a street sweeper. And he lived his entire life working like this as an informal waste collector. And this was the big phenomenon of the 1980s, is that hundreds and thousands of people entered the sector of waste collection, and they were not, while not being public workers, were being outside of the Union of Sanitation Workers. Just a quick measure of that. I compiled this from different sources, including my own estimates for 2019, which are always difficult because it really depends on the zone where you're working and the experience of the worker, etc. But from the 1990s, rather than wages, and even for formal workers, wages became relatively marginal to their earning compared to what they were making from tips from residents. So traditionally, if you pick up waste for residents or you give an extra service, you pick up door to door, you receive a tip, and you also make money from recycling. And so that became much more important to their living than wages. So that was the major transformation that hit the union. What happened at the same time also is opening to international trade. So waste became much more rich in plastics, for example. So waste itself became much more valuable. At the same time, you have many neighborhood economies of recycling that developed as a result of the crisis. So it became much easier to, in a sense, to commodify waste by reselling it in your neighborhood bodega de reciclaje, so recycling, informal recycling place. So what happened to the union is that one thing that it had been a given for 80 years suddenly shifted, it's the monopoly of the union over waste collection. All of a sudden, you had all this informal economy that was willing to do the same job without being paid by the government. So the big question for the union that emerged then is how do we protect our monopoly in front of that, faced with that? There was this question, monopoly protection. Alors, the second process that jolted this corporatist configuration between the party state and the union was urban autonomization. So there was austerity in waste management that started before when the city was pushed to balance its own books in the 70s. So there was a lot of neglect of waste management. They stopped hiring sanitation workers. But even as Mexico City system was gradually, Mexico's state cooperative systems was gradually dismantled under the administration of Salinas, for example, the PRI continued to invest heavily in the union of sanitation workers and in traditional garbage politics, particularly under the mayorship of Manuel Camacho Solis, who, for different reasons, one of the reasons was that he was himself hoping to get the PRI, to be the PRI candidate in '94, so he heavily reinvested the union as a base of support for his campaign. But it was also the general, when it was clear that the PRI was going to lose the city in 1997, and that it was, for a long time, the left had been much more stronger in neighborhoods. Traditional unions were the only thing that were left for the PRI. So when the PRI was about to lose the city in the late 90s, what they did is that they also heavily reinvested that union in particular, which they knew was very powerful because the biggest part of the general union of public workers in Mexico City had a lot of street power, a lot of capacity to disturb the city. And so they invested it heavily. They granted most of the workers that still have public contracts today were granted their contracts in the mid-90s under the mayorship of Camacho Solis. All of them are in their 60s now. There were no recruitments since. Basically, there were no recruitments since. So all of them are from that period. They are diehards of the PRI, of course, even though they've had to support the left government for the past 20 years. But this reinvestment of the PRI meant that when the left, the PRD, came to power, then they had to deal with the massive union of sanitation workers that was still controlled by the PRI. So the PRD came into power to manage the city, but it actually didn't control waste management. Waste management was still controlled by the PRI. So there was then it was a very long conflict for the left to try to undermine the power of the PRI. At first, it was very difficult, and when Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas came to power, the PRI still had the federal level, so he didn't even try to curtail the power of the union. It was AMLO, López Obrador, when he came to power, then the federal government had become PAN, so the PRI had lost also the federal government. That's when he was able to push back against the union of sanitation workers. And despite series of strikes, he was eventually able to replace the head of the union of Mexico City public workers. And actually we saw then, and actually at the time, to put the union at the service of his own campaign and his own bid to become president of Mexico in 2006, the election that he lost by a very tight margin. So, but when the left came into power and after it had regained some control over waste collectors, it didn't intend to refuel those corporatist networks that the PRI had in the city. First, because it didn't have the fiscal means to do so, unlike the PRI at the time, which had federal resources to fuel those clientelist corporatist networks. And second, because the strength of the PRD was not these corporatist politics, it was not unions, but the whole PRD movement was built in neighborhoods, in popular neighborhoods around more urban issues of access to services, access to housing. So the real strength of and what the PRD would install was a very tight neighborhood control, particularly in popular neighborhood, but they did not try to reinvest those corporatist politics. Okay, so now I better move fast. So because of that, because the left stopped hiring waste workers as an attempt to weaken the union, then in the 2000s, that's when really the informalization process that was undergoing really accelerated, and by the end you had about a third of informal workers in 1997, but by the end of the 2010s, by my own estimates in the neighborhood I was studying, you had 75 to 80% of informal workers operating the public service of waste collection. Okay, so this is what happened, to sum up. One, this question of competition by informal waste workers and the need for the union to protect its monopoly, and second, the fact that resources stop coming from above. So what does the union do to in face of those challenges? What the union did is it actually managed to integrate informal workers into the union, and it turned its logic completely upside down from its reproduction depending on money coming from the state upstream to extracting resources from the informal economy to reproduce its own structures. So it shifted its logic of rent extraction, and it's starting extracting rents for informal workers who have to pay every week when they're working to be guaranteed special streets where they can work without problem, etc. The second thing that they did is that they adapted to, in order to protect their monopoly, they also adapted to the PRD, to the left government's own political structures, and they shifted their attention not to the top but to neighborhood politics, and they put their workers at the service of local neighborhood clientelist systems. So I'll say a quick word about that. So the biggest puzzle for me to solve was how did they manage to actually integrate informal workers? If you're an informal worker, would you work under the union if you have to pay? Not only do you have to pay, but I'll say in a minute, you have to be politically active. There's a lot of extra labor that's asked for you to attend political meetings, etc., etc. Why would you do that rather than just working independently as informal workers where you don't have to pay anyone? One answer, there are two answers to that. The first one is kinship. So actually a lot of these informal workers are part of family networks of long-established waste workers. So for example, Angel here in the middle, he is a street sweeper in a particular street. He has two streets that he can mine, that he sweeps, he extracts resources from. But he's the son of an established street sweeper, and so his father does not work anymore for health issues, and Angel is not paid, but because his father is part of the union, he has sort of a guarantee that he can sweep on his father's zone. So there's entire networks like this of family solidarities that have made sure that even informal workers, even sometimes through fictive kinship, fictive family ties, remain tied to the core of the union and established formal workers. But most of the workers are still non-patrimonial informal workers. So how do you lock them into this union system, right? The first thing is that the union controls the waste infrastructure. But that's so if you want, for example, transfer station, etc. So you kind of have to go through the union at some point. The second element is that workers are always somewhat hoping that there will be in the future a wave of regularization, so that one day eventually they might get a contract, at least temporary. Actually, it happened in the late 2010s. So here you find really the Javier Urguio's politics of waiting, right? You're always waiting always hoping that eventually this contract will come. I don't think, however, that these workers are completely illusioned about, because at the time, before the late 2010s, contracts had not come for 20 years, so I don't think they were illusioned completely about the fact that eventually the contract would come. But actually what the union does is that it pushes informal workers to do more than their work. They're already paying to work, but they're pushed to do even more than that because they're pushed to do many things for local neighborhood politics. They're pushed to attend political meetings, before elections, for example, they're sent to paint houses by the party. They're sent to, for example, the union has a sports complex in the center of Mexico City, so they're sent there to revamp ahead of the 2018 elections. They were sent there to revamp the sports complex for free, right? I mean, they're informal workers. That was a usual practice in unions, Mexican unions in the 20th century, but for workers that had a salary. But these guys, they have no salary. They're informal workers, and they're sent to do this extra work. So they come back home at the end of the day. They have only lost money, right? Because they've paid for transportation, but they have not had a salary. And they've not been able to make their money from waste collection. And so basically they've pushed to do that, and in that they're pushed to build up their mérito. That is, that when the contract will come, they'll be at the front of the line because they've done all of this. They've shown that they're politically active, that they support the union leadership, etc. So when you have your mérito that you've grown, though your mérito has no value elsewhere, basically. It only has value within this union. I mean, it's, and so if you try to move away, then you lose all of this you've built. That's, I think, a major mechanism for locking in workers, those informal workers. And in turn, what's really convenient, well, it works in a synergy with the need for the union to protect its monopoly, because all of what it does for local clientelist systems, for local politics, ensures that the local delegados, the district mayors, will do what it takes to protect the union's monopoly, that is to mobilize the police against piratas. Piratas are those informal waste collectors that are not affiliated to the union, so that the union calls piratas, pirates. And so basically it uses all of this labor, also informal labor, to make sure that he has constant support from the local district mayor to protect its monopoly, also to grant it, because the local district mayors are the ones granting garbage trucks, for example. So union will receive garbage trucks from the local alcalde and then resell it to its own workers. Another means of locking in informal workers is to have recourse, is direct violence also. So it can be through recourse to the police, but it can also be direct violence if you're caught collecting waste in the street. You're not entitled to, you're not with the union, you face the risk of being roasted by union workers. I'm out of time.
Yes, but you can conclude.
I will try to conclude quickly. Okay. So this is, I hope I gave a more or less intelligible picture of this transformation that produced a guild-like organization, in that it's built on a very vertical, tight exploitation system between different statuses of workers, and that's an organization that reproduces itself based on these bottom resources, these resources it can extract from the bottom and that go up, versus the patronage system of the past, right? Which resources came upward. And also through its became also this guild-like organization through its attempt to protect its monopoly through engaging local politics and at the very local level, and it became this organization that has a complete self-regulation of labor, controls completely labor regulation practices within waste management. And unlike the corporate system of the 20th century, whose autonomy is not dependent on negotiation with the state. Its autonomy is grounded in its control, its ability to self-regulate, to control labor. So it's basically impossible to move for any city government, right? Because you don't have direct control of workers. There's no way you can subtract the control of workers to that union. Now, so it's basically what happened to successive PDD governments and then Morena governments when they've tried, and I'll conclude on that, to regain control over the union because they wanted to over workers because they wanted to reform the sector. For example, in the late 2000s, again, under the mayorship of Ebrard, there was a big waste crisis. Well, a lot of pressure to reform waste management because one of the main landfills closed in Mexico City, and so there was an attempt to implement separated waste collection. So for that, you had to rely on the union. So they granted organic bonuses to workers. In the end, the organic bonuses were seized by the union leadership, and it had little effect. It's about $1 million per year that dissipates into the union. And so the same happened when the union leadership was, the union actually managed to impose its own norm, to have an article basically made tailored for it in the Mexico City Constitution, Article 16, that prohibited the privatization of waste collection and asserted that the service ought to remain free for residents, that considerably restrained what the city was able to do, how the city would be able to tackle the union and to try to implement some new reforms of waste management. I'm going very fast, but then later there were more direct attempts at putting in place regulations of the labor of informal workers to formalize them. There was a big push for that, notably by various NGOs, associations, and this started a new. There were contracts that were distributed, but again, impossible to go around the union to distribute those contracts to actual workers. So there was a new, and Sheinbaum has never been able to regain control of the union or over workers, even though she had a very, very ambitious waste management plan to implement. And that's when I was working with her administration at some point. They were thinking about, wow, we have this amazing plan, but actually, how are we going to do it? All of the people that knew all these corporatist politics from the PRD from the 2000s, they were not in the administration anymore. It was a whole new set of people that came from academics, people that came from environmental movements. They had no knowledge over those union politics, and they found themselves before a wall at that point that they were never able to cross. So just to conclude, 30-second, I think what I just described is actually these conflicts between struggles between a guild-like organization that controls workers, able to regulate labor in the city, and an urban administration, an urban government that negotiate with it, struggles with it to impose its own terms, etc. I think it's actually a very common configuration historically. Prior to the spread of nation states and the union form, I mean, it was a very classic, both in colonial Spain, in post-Mughal North India, in Europe, obviously in the Gilded Age of cities, in pre-colonial Nigeria. It's a very common configuration of actors that regulate labor together, cities and guild-like organization like that. And my hypothesis is that perhaps it's becoming increasingly a common configuration in large cities, especially large cities that have gained a large political autonomy in the past decades, at the same time as they were experiencing very deep economic crises. So I think it might be worth looking more systematically at this and how cities attempt to regulate world labors, and those organizations such as this guild-like organization in Mexico City with which they clash, compete and collaborate, because at the intersection of the two, a lot of the political institutions get shaped, and also the labor conditions and practices of workers get shaped at the same time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wow, thank you very much, Côme, for a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed very much your agenda. I think it's a very ambitious and very important one. I have some comments, but maybe I can open for questions, or I'll do my comments and then I will open for questions. Well, first of all, this idea of how to study urban labor regulation in urban studies, I think this is a really important issue, but I was wondering how we can connect the transformation of labor, the transformation of political dynamics, and also the transformation of cities, you know, because especially in the global south, but not only, we are also talked about different ways of dealing with the urban space and how this type of public services arrive at the peripheries, you know, so how we can connect these dynamics. For instance, Eduardo and myself, we have done some works before on how different labor groups are located in the space, how we deal with segregation and access to services, so how we historically can interconnect these different dynamics, you know, because I was also wondering about this, you know, because the labor regulation is shaping the urban institution, but also the space. So how we can deal with this, especially when we have changes in the environmental agendas. Now we are talking about reciclagem, recycling. I'm tired, so I'm stupid. We are talking about recycling. We are combining types of waste collection. So I think it's important to think about this. And I was also wondering about the relationship between these different groups. As you were ending, at the end of your presentation, we were talking about this, and I was thinking about this multi-layer perspective on the regulation, because now we have environmental laws, we have a concern about closing landfills. So how the interplay between the layers can be taken all together to understand this, the interplay between the regulations, and how this interplay change or not the power game between the social groups. Because here, in the way you present your work, I was wondering, what is the state doing at the local level, Because it's much more a matter of self-regulating actors than a matter of what is the state doing, And what about private actors? Because here in São Paulo, this is a really big issue. Waste collection. Eduardo has a brilliant student that studied this, Samuel Halise. The private companies have a really big interplay with the waste collectors, and there is public and private and organization. So there is no private actors playing a role in this story you are telling us. So I would like to hear more about the state and the private actors. And also, it would be great to hear more from you about the methods and how you are comparing your case. What is common or what is similar in the Nigerian case and the Mexican case, and how the way you merge it into the fieldwork helped you to compare those two cases. Okay, and now we have a question. Is it okay? We can collect more. Okay, Eduardo, you have to come here and talk in the mic. Sorry, I can give you the mic. No, you sit and I do this. It's fine. You are the invited one, the guest. So let's do this.
Thank you. It was a collective effort to make the mic appear here. Well, I have to. Thanks, Côme. It was very, very interesting to hear. I have three observations, which are kind of questions, but actually dialogues, points of dialogue with your research. The first one is maybe a suggestion that you maybe it's better not to start with the idea of labor and to start with the idea of services, because your case is really, really interesting, considering not exactly work. Well, the work dimensions are, or the labor dimensions are interesting, but for the point of view of urban research, I think trying to show or advertising the research as how services are provided in a very large, complex city by guilds of workers instead of state structures, and that this is really strong. Actually, the case becomes much stronger. So, and then the puzzle is why the hell this didn't become a market. And this is really, really interesting. And this leads to Renata's question, because in the case of São Paulo, where not only São Paulo, the Brazilian cities, we got from individual providers, as the Mexican case, to municipal companies that bought the trucks and well, this was in the 30s, so they were, or even in the 10s, they were chariots with horses and things like that, and they were all became a state monopoly, and then the private companies became, as the city grew, the municipalities couldn't face the service anymore directly, so they started to hire private companies, and then it became a huge capitalist market. The last concession in the municipality of São Paulo was a concession of 20 years, and it was 20 billion. Yes, 20 billion, not 20, 30 years. 30 years, 20 billion reais. So it's really $4 billion. So it's really large market, and so I think the idea of the market should have more, or the puzzle of why this didn't become a market should be. And the third question would be, tell us something about Lagos, because it's really it's the non-case that and it's really interesting would be interesting to hear more about how you compare this with Lagos.
Thank you, Côme. Very interesting. A long time we want to hear from you. So it's a very interesting case. I have similar questions with Renata and Eduardo, and I should ask you some question about my point of view. And this question would be, where is the public funding? What happened with the public funding in all this time? Because it was a monopoly with public funding. You mentioned corruption. Then this change to this guild type of organization. You have a lot of informal money, but you have public funding, isn't it? So how do you regulate all this mess and informal contracts? And then why don't you have a market in Cidade de México? It's very strange.
Anybody else, or maybe we can return to you and then we open again to questions. Go ahead.
Thank you thank you so much for your question. I think they overlap a lot, so maybe I'm start to have first a general answer. In my PhD dissertation, I actually present much more directly the question of the public service provision and this question of the market, and in between I've also worked with Enzo Mingione on the colonial, more looking at it in the colonial dimension, so looking at exactly this question of why has it not become a market, and what is it in place that has prevented it from becoming a market in both Lagos and Mexico City. So the reason why I presented it more in the labor regulation perspective is because I'm trying to test this and see if it's interesting or not. Maybe not so much, but I'll think about that later. But so yes, it is fascinating, and it's the case in both. What became the comparison between Mexico City and Lagos is obviously they're very different cities, and waste management works completely differently in both cities. But what's remarkable about them is that, well, first of all, they have in common the fact that they became largely autonomous from they were capitals, both capital cities. Lagos lost its capital city status, but they became both largely autonomous politically from the federal level in the late 90s, and both at the end of a period of very intense economic crisis. So they have all of that in common. And in both cases, you have very informal waste economies that developed in the 80s and 90s, and then urban governments that had to grapple with them at the beginning of the 2000s. But it works very differently in Lagos. It works through very localized arrangement. You have a mixture of patronage politics that controls very small service providers, and informal economies controlled by street lords, so basically criminal networks. But what they have in common is the fact that indeed, and it was the whole reason for the whole argument about these comparing these two cities, is that in this process of political autonomization of the cities, there's actually very strong popular forms of regulations that developed in popular neighborhoods. So, or within these ossified structures of Mexican corporatism, there's forms of basically taken over by the union, which belonged to the PRI, was basically taken over by workers themselves and transformed in order to transform into the guild in order to protect the sector against any attempt to privatize. There were already attempts to privatize in the 1990s, but they developed very strong mechanisms to prevent that. And there was, all governments have, including the PRI in the 90s and including Salinas, when there was at first an attempt to privatize the sector, I've completely given up on the very possibility to privatize it. In Lagos, the same happened. So it's very different forms of popular regulation, but more structured at the neighborhood level, but very tightly controlled by the networks of the APC, which is the party that controls Lagos. And same, there were attempts to privatize the sector not long ago, about 5 years ago. And the governor that privatized the sector had to resign a year later, after there was a complete, very deep political crisis in Lagos. The whole party base turned against the governor. The press was titling, "It's the garbage war." The whole waste collection system collapsed, and so the governor had to resign, and we're back to the previous system with small, very small, they're actually private, very small private, but not strongly capitalized, and waste providers, which are tied to the networks of the party. So in both cases, there are two, in that sense, very interesting cases indeed of a market that cannot take root because there are very strong mechanisms in place that operate at different levels. It's political power, it's weight on the streets, it's weights in the polls, but it's also arms on the street, right? In Lagos, it was also about simply when they tried to privatize the system, the actor that was granted was actually a private actor that was completely made up on the occasion by a big Lagos family. The trucks could not enter the neighborhoods a lot of the time because they were kicked out by area boys that were tied to the party. So there was, it's not just political, it's also very physical on the street. It can get very physical, but it can also get very institutional. For example, in Mexico City, the union, during the period of ratification of the Mexico City constitutions, they were in a position of force because the Mexico City government was trying to reform the sector and to say, okay, now we have to separate waste, we have to send organic waste to composting plants. So the Union of Sanitation Workers like, okay, we can do that, but it's going to be, in exchange, you're going to have to give us a lot. You're going to have to give us resources, public resources, but you also have to put it in the law that you cannot privatize the sector, and put it in the law that you cannot have a tax for waste collection. This is what happened. This is in the Mexico City Constitution, Article 16. The fact that they made it clear in the Constitution that you cannot make people pay for waste collection means that the administration is in a dead end, because in order to be able to implement a new policy to go around the union, you would need a lot of resources. But you cannot, at least officially, there's probably ways around that, but you cannot officially, because this system as it is now is self-financed based on the exploitation of informal waste workers and on the tips that residents pay directly to those informal waste workers. So if you want to have a proper formalization policy and to bring in for example, cooperatives of workers to operate waste collection, you need extra resources. You need to formalize the collection of that waste fee that people actually pay, but that doesn't go through the state, through the Mexico City government administration. So the fact that they put that in the law prevents really any type of reform. And the public servants I was working with at the time were amazed when they discovered that, right? They discovered it in the way as they were trying to prepare their plan for waste management revamp. They discovered, okay, we can't actually do anything because it's in the Constitution. They were amazed at that, and they didn't know where it had come from exactly, but who had... I didn't investigate specifically this. So this is on the market, and I'm already speaking a bit about public funding, right? So there's public funding in two ways. Let's say there's public funding because those contracts that were awarded in 1990s, well, the city still pays those workers. And then there's also funding that goes to the infrastructure. And for the waste management infrastructure, but I've talked mostly about the waste collection, so there's still funding that goes into trucks. For example, when a truck is granted to the union will resell the truck to its workers, to established workers, right? So the union gets a truck from the government for free, of course and the union is in charge of distributing the truck. And so the truck will be, the union will not give out the truck for free to a worker, because for a worker, a truck is like an investment that then you will use for the rest of your life, and you will make a profit of it. So the union will resell the truck at different prices depending who you are in the union. But everything works that way. So the same for when the organic, so there was the Ebrard government in 2010 granted a bonus for the separation of organic waste to workers. So any workers that separated organic waste was entitled to a bonus by ton. So in the first years, it worked more or less. The bonus was, so it was distributed through the union leadership. For the first years ahead of the election, it worked somewhat. After 1 year, 2 years, you see it's here, you see the rate slowly falling against the rate of separation, slowly falling again, simply because at that point the union had decided that it was going to keep the union leadership decided that it was going to keep the bonus for itself, right? And workers were not really seeing the bonus coming to them anymore. They didn't see the money, right? So given this in place, the first strategy of the left in the 2000s under Obrador was to just not put money in waste management anymore. In plants, okay, in landfills, but even still, some landfills were still controlled by the PRI at the time. So the strategy was, and it's the reason why the sector informalized so fast, was that they didn't distribute jobs anymore. I mean, they didn't hire sanitation workers for about nearly 20 years. So it's basically the only strategy they had, which is we cannot spend any money, send any public money to this sector, because it's gonna reinforce the machine that we're gonna feed this guild-like institution that's gonna reinforce even further its control in the sector, in which every piece of public money they give them. It's pretty much exactly what happened. But then things changed a bit in the late 2010s, because there was a new push. There was a recommendation by a human rights court at the Mexico City level that said, okay, this cannot go on anymore with informal workers operating most of the waste collection in Mexico City, of public waste collection. So we have to do something about this. We have to regularize those workers. We have to intervene to try to regulate this labor. And so there was a new push, a new coalition that pushed for, because in the early 2000s, the whole left and in the center right, the entire press agreed with what the left was doing. That is, we have to stop giving money to waste management. We have to curtail the power of the union as much as possible. But then there was a shift of discourse, maybe also because it was not the same generation anymore that had understood those union politics back in the day. So there was a new push to give contracts again to workers through the union, because there's no other choice. And so ahead of the election of the arrival of Morena, the head of Mexico City, the election of Sheinbaum, there was a massive distribution of contracts again. But much like in the old days, those contracts were distributed to family members, party members, so the whole same story again. And the same happened, basically. It was the same. The PRD used the same strategy as the PRI in the late 90s. The PRD was losing Mexico City, but it tried to remain in control of a few things, and one of the things was the Union of Sanitation Workers. So Mancera, then president, was like, okay, we have this momentum, we're going to give a lot of money to the Union of Sanitation Workers so that they stay loyal to us. Didn't work for them, didn't work for Morena either, who's not been able to regain control of those workers and of those contracts that were distributed. I don't know if I've answered your... But yeah, this is the public funding situation. There is some public funding, but mostly the strategy has been to curtail it as much as possible at the expense in the end of the informal waste workers that are operating the system. Yeah. You cannot have, no, absolutely not. And it's now in the constitution that you cannot have it.
And nobody knows how they put this in the constitution?
I haven't looked, 'cause it was really not my fieldwork, it was a whole different thing. I haven't looked into, I only discussed it with civil servants, but I mean, it was pretty clear that there was a coalition at the time that was becoming stronger and stronger. At the time, they drafted the constitution between the mayor and the Union of Sanitation Workers. So the Constitutive Assembly was broad, but you had politicians in there. You had politicians loyal to the mayor, so it could have happened in many ways.
Yes.
Thank you. You gave another wonderful description of something very powerful, which is could be framed as how the dissolution, the dissolution of Mexican corporatism led Mexico not to public service provision, but to some kind of private control by a gilded syndicate, something like that. It is another way of, and I think this is broader than the other one. And they could give you two very good articles. The first one, send it to Iger. It's really an Iger text, but the second one, I think it's a political science kind of contribution. Very nice.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I don't have my notes. I have understanding questions. So I would like to understand better what you mean by guild-like, because I'm thinking of guild as I'm European. I'm thinking about it as a European concept, and if I'm not mistaken, from work like Abraham de Zwaan, the guild developed as a solution to conflict, right? It was a conflict resolution kind of thing. So I wondered why you call it guild-like, and what exactly you mean by that, and what is the analytical gain from doing that. My second question is regarding the tips. I'm learning from my Brazilian colleagues at the moment to always ask the question, how voluntary is it? Right? So you talk about the persons giving tips, and I'm thinking about, I don't know, maybe I'm too biased now because I have a colleague that works on militias in Rio and explains all the time about how nothing is voluntary. So in your story, the payment to the workers is voluntary because it's just tips that residents like to give. And I wondered about that, but this is maybe a question that Brazilians can formulate much better than I can. And related to that, I then thought, well, what about the guns? Because there's a lot of violence in your account, right? There's a lot of they get beat up, and then they get sent to beat those people up, and I'm sort of wondering what they're beating with, if it's just with their fists, and if there is also guns and all that kind of stuff involved, then where's the crime? Because someone is gonna bring those objects to do the violence to people, right? And violence need to be learned and trained, and just to send a group of men in the neighborhood to beat someone else up means that you have to teach them how to do that. So it suggests there's another actor to me, but maybe I'm completely wrong. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Can I build a little bit on that? I do agree with Edu on a broader way of framing it, but because we had the opportunity to discuss our researchers doing PhD and all, I kind of also can see how you made it be about regulation and labor, because you were following brokers and that's your main concerns. But then, building a bit on what Talia asked, if your question is how cities regulate labor, or cities, you will eventually be more specific about it, but then becomes about the word regulation. Like she mentioned a couple of ways of informal regulation, like threatening. You also mentioned one in your talk about they would lose merit if they change the small group they are part of. So all of these are forms of regulation, and that could be part of your framing if you're interested in that. Also labor. Maybe if you're working with the category labor, then you need to be serious about how do they perceive labor, right? And how has that changed through time? If rights are not what they fight for anymore, how has that changed? Like, it's super interesting, has many things, but maybe the way you frame could take us by hand and link things.
Thank you for your questions. On guilds, I think the analogy or the reason why I speak of guild-like organization, the first reason is I had to search for a different object, right, to categorize this organization, right. It still has the face of a union, it's still treated as a union, but it's not actually operate as a union or even as a corporation, even in specifically Mexican context, right? I had to find an object to clarify a distinction in the way it's transformed itself from being a corporatist union in the 20th century to how it works today. What a lot of the time, an easy categorization of the union of sanitation workers. In daily life, if you talk to a taxi driver, he will tell you, well, this is actually a mafia. So mafia would be a candidate, right, as an object to categorize this organization. I'm not so sure about the idea of mafia. First of all, because it's much. Yes, it's hierarchical, and it's also. A mafia. Mafia, it's a very broad type of organization. We can call anything a mafia. If it were a criminal organization, it would be much closer to Napolitan Camorra, for example, or because it's much grounded in space, in control of urban space, etc. But it's not an organization that operates primarily through violence. That's the first thing. Workers can mobilize to punish some. It is not a cooperative, from how it is defined today in Latin. As often used as a policy, even or policy tool in Latin America. Or for example, it's very different from the movements you see in Argentina of cartoneros. Right? There's absolutely no attempt to have rights recognized for workers. No any type of democratic horizontal life. So it could, a cooperative would be a candidate as well, but I think it's still a bit far from what we usually call a cooperative in Latin America or in East Africa, where they become common as well. It's still pretty far from a cooperative. So what I found interesting about this idea of guild-like organization is I find very strong analogies in the fact that the core goal of the organization is to protect a monopoly. So that was the core goal of colonial, at least Spanish colonial guilds in Buenos Aires, in Mexico City, in Guadalajara. The core goal is to protect the monopoly, and for that you have to negotiate with local authorities. And more than violence, that's what this union does. This union of sanitation works. The way it works is it negotiates, it has various transactions, political transactions with various political actors at the city and district level in order to protect its monopoly. And mostly it does not do it itself, but it does it through recourse to institutions, through law, modifying the constitution, recourse to the police. So it's not a mafia in this sense, it's much more like a guild organization. Another feature of a guild organization which contrasts with the union is the fact that it has very vertical organizations with very tight exploitation structures within the union. You know, in the classic guild, it was European guild, it was the apprentice, the journeyman, the master. Well, here it's the chalán, the voluntario, and the trabajador de base. You find the same modes of the same internal structures and modes of internal exploitation within the organization. So I think this sort of forgotten object of the guild, in my perspective, might be interesting, at least as an analogy to understand what's going on with this organization. How voluntary are the tips? I've actually found a lot of discussions in the Mexican press in the 2000s over this question. You had op-eds who were talking about it as a form of corruption. An illustration of Mexican corruption is the fact that you have to tip the waste collector. What's interesting, though, is that when this practice of tipping existed prior to the informalization of waste collection. But what's interesting is that when wages decreased very, very fast in the 80s, tips did not decrease that fast. Probably the result of the fact that, you know, resources available to households did not decrease as fast as wages, because they put more people in the labor market in each family, etc. But so the practice has always existed, and I think it's if you individually you don't pay your propina to the waste collector, nothing is going to happen at all. Just that someone is not going to come to your door to collect your garbage bin or garbage bag. However, I think it works more as a form of collective control with neighbors, because if an entire street starts not paying proper propinas to the waste collectors, then okay, something will happen, and the waste collectors will less often or not at all to your street, right? So if you want to maintain a good, it's more of a question like that, a long-term question, a long-term form of community regulation. If you want to maintain a good service in the longer term, you have to maintain good relations so that, you know, they will come twice a week or maybe 3 times a week, versus if you start having a bad community. I mean, if this goes wrong, then they will not come at all, and the sanitation situation in your street will really get bad. So I think it's more this community regulation matter. And Thelma, well, I agree, but I'll think about it. But yeah, I don't really have an answer, right? I have to think about it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everybody, for this very interesting discussion and afternoon.